Good. Let's go.
All right, hi everyone. Good to be with you, especially at this challenging time, and hoping the fruit of our learning will maybe bring a little bit of calm, not peace. That seems like a far fetch, but calm. So today we are going to be jumping in to what happens when basar v'challah interact, but not in a full-blown cooking sense. So we're sort of removed a little bit from the most intense mechanisms of actual intense heat of the two things interacting with each other. But of course, after that, there are different levels of what I'd call gray, all of which we've seen when we did Isur V'Heter, Shar Isurim, right? Kavush, Malicha, Tata Gavar, right? These are all concepts we've seen before. And now we're going to see how they interact with Basar B'Chalav. Are they the same? Are they different? And then we will go through there. I will give a disclaimer that I moved this weekend. So my notes and things are a little bit I'm in the same location that I moved. I'm just in the old location. So my notes are a little bit all over the place, but we will, so bear with me. I sent out last week a source sheet, mostly contained the Gemara and then the citations for where you could look in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm going to throw that again in the chat right here for you all to look on. And honestly, it would just be easier, I think, if everyone opens it up themselves, and that way I don't have to share a screen and worry about changing tabs. But for one thing, I am going to share my screen. But for the most part, everyone should feel free to open that up by themselves, and then we will move through there. So we're going to jump right in into one of these background Gemara, which come from the first one comes from Chulin Daf Kuv Zayin Amud Bet, and I'm just going to go based on the order that's on my screen, and then if you'd like to pass, feel free to pass. So Isaac, why don't you start us off with the Gemara?
Okay. צורר אדם בשר וגבינה מפרחת אחת, ובלבד שלא יהיו נוגעים זה בזה. All right, that's the Mishnah. So you can wrap cheese and meat in a single little bundle, just so long as they're not touching each other. And in the Gemara, v'chi nogea ze baze, mai have. Sonen betonen hu. Amar Abaye, Nehi biklifa labaye, hadacha mi labaye. Okay, so the Gemara says, what happens if they do touch each other? Isn't it just tonen betonen? It's cold and cold, so it shouldn't be a problem. Abaye says, okay, so it doesn't need a klipa taken off of either of them, but are you going to tell me they don't need to be rinsed? With the implied corollary of obviously they need to be rinsed.
Great, so thanks. So I can't tell if halacha as an innovation here, but at least before you get to the teirutz, it seems to be like our options are theoretically full-blown isur, never going to be able to eat it unless maybe there's some bitul going on, permitted, and then the middle category only is klipa, right, where you shave off a little bit. But then we get this another middle case in which actually we don't have to do anything as severe as a klipa, but instead we can do hadacha. We can do washing. So based on this Mishnah and this Gemara, it seems that we can tie them together. Of course, the Mishnah indicates that they shouldn't ideally be touching, right? And we'll return to that language later. But after the fact that they can be washed and you're good to go, and we don't need a klipa. Does anybody have any insights from this Gemara? Joel, you look like you want to say something.
I always thought it was like, like every time I've ever shown this Mishnah to somebody, like they like flip, wait, you can wrap them in the same, napkin. Like what is going on here? And I think, I don't know, Abaye, even when he seems a little bit troubled by not so much the wrapping together, but like, come on, they might touch each other, even though the Mishnah's like, yeah, as long as they don't. But I mean, come on, we've all put stuff in napkins in a bag and what happens. And I actually do think that there is like a sense here, like even though Abaye is kind of repulsed by it to some extent, of like, yeah, tzonen b'tzonen, like who cares, right? There's no like really, like the whole thing is about cooking, the whole thing is about transferring something between the two, if it's Tom or something else, and there's no transfer. Although we're going to see, right, hadacha becomes a huge thing where it's like
So Joel, you're like worried it's going to lead to mixed dancing, that cheese and.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that becomes a major, right? I think there's a shach later, right? It's going to say, like in a meat pot or a meat dish that, if you put something cold in it, like don't make that like arai, that's fine. But like to make that a kavua thing is going to be a major problem.
Yeah. Joel, I think what you're pointing to is like the Mishnah, obviously the Mishnah is a rabbinic text, but the Mishnah is sort of like really leaning into like the Deoraita rules. It's like, we care about cooking. Otherwise, like it doesn't make a difference. Though there is this element of they don't want shelo nogim b'zeh, like they don't really want it to touch, but like overall we're fine. And like as the Amoraim take onto on the Mishnah, it's like, what are you kidding me? In some ways I sort of view this hadacha as sort of like a check, not as like a full blow. Like the question is like if you do hadacha like b'diavad, are you like those questions like you'd have to interact with, but here it's more of like a light check on the process.
Yeah, no, I'm thank you for making sense of my like just rambling there, but no, I think that is the thing. Is like there is some feeling that when things that shouldn't be interacting with each other interact, you need to have some sort of action that undoes it, and I think that maybe that is what the hadacha is like. Yes, you're also getting rid of like whatever Tom is or little pieces of particles are sitting there, but at the same time you're also like, I don't know, for me personally, like you need to make a separation, and that's hadacha is a separation at the end of the day. So
right, obviously kalim and foods are different, but in some ways they're analogized here, right? You do need to do some sort of tikkun to like get you going.
Yeah,
I thought if a Gemara has a pshat, I thought at least the pshat of this Gemara is coming from the other side. It's saying like, why should it's saying like, okay, but what is actually the problem with them touching? Like, why are you telling me not to make them touch? It's just, right? And then we have to come in with like, oh, actually we should do something if they touch.
Right. So I think Yavni, I think that's a good edit. I think more than the Mishnah, the Gemara is like, Torah says lo tivashel, folks. Like what like how more explicit can you be? And then it's like, sorry, by like ramping up, it's like, oh, at least what, don't need hadacha, right? Great, that's a good edit, amazing. So let's see. I reckon we're mostly not gonna, we're gonna engage in some Rishonim and do some light tour, but there are a bunch of important shachs that I want to get to, so we're gonna spend majority flowing there. So we're gonna jump right into the Shulchan Aruch, Seif Aleph. Who's next? Josh, can you take it us?
Sorry, can you? Maybe someone else takes this. Maybe someone else takes this, and I'll.
Oh, okay.
By myself.
All right, Yavni, go ahead.
בשר וגבינה שנגעו זה בזה מותרים, אלא שצריך להדיח מקום נגיעתן, ומותר לצור אותם במטפחת אחת, ולא חיישינן שמא ייגעו זה בזה. Should I translate?
Yep, go for it.
So meat and cheese that touched each other, they're permitted, but you should rinse them off in the plate, rinse off the spot that had contact, and you're allowed to wrap them up together in one handkerchief. And if you wrap them up, you don't worry that they did touch.
Right. So sort of a restatement of or the implication of our Mishnah with Abaye's addition, though it does align the issue a little bit where it says v'lo chayshinan shema yigu zeh bazeh, where our Mishnah is uvilvad shelo yugu zeh bazeh, right? So the Mishnah seems to actually be a little bit more concerned than the way that the Shulchan Aruch phrases it. It's like the Mishnah's like, you need to make sure that they don't touch. But here it's like, you know what? It's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Because I think presumably once you have Abaye in the mix and you can either view Hadacha as a Chumrah, where it's like they touched, now I need to do this thing as opposed to just consuming it. Or in some ways you can view it as like a Kula, meaning like, you know what? It's okay. Like you don't want them to touch, but it is okay if they do touch because you have this fix, which depending on how you look at it is either a help or a hurt. So the Shach gives an important limitation on this ruling. So Asher, can you take on Shach Aleph?
Okay, Shach is אלא שצריך להדיח וכולי, וכתב בית חירה.
בית חדש, the Bach.
בית חדש, בית חדש, דווקא כשאחד מהן לך, אבל אם שניהם יבשים, אפילו הדחה אין צורך. So, בית חדש wrote that this condition about the hadacha is specifically if one of the two items is moist or wet. If they're both dry, you don't even need to do hadacha.
Right. So that's really important because look, when I'm thinking of storing something, my mind is I'm going to go storing to dry goods. That to me is like in the a priori case, but at least here the Shach is drawing a differentiation between wet and dry. Joel, go ahead.
I wonder. It never occurred to me before, but the Shach is taking kibbutz kach poto very seriously, right? I mean the Bach really, not the Shach here, of the sense of lach belach, right? How is there any transfer of time? And not lach belach, yavesh biyavesh, right? It's yavesh. There's nothing, right? But if there's liquid involved, then you need liquid to undo it, and that's the only case where you need to do hadacha, something like that. In the same way that you would need to do hagala if you boil something in it. It's
right. Not that I want to get into this whole when the Mishnah talks about this. Do you think they have this? It has this distinction in mind. This is not just for you, Joel. Anyone. I suspect not. Meaning, my guess is the Mishnah probably just has this blanket rule. And look, the Bach's quite late compared to the Mishnah. So, yeah. So again, we have this is the general rule. If at least one of the elements is lost, you have hadacha, yavesh biyavesh, you're good to go. Ravlanda, do you want to say something? No. Okay.
No, it's fine.
Okay, perfect. So that is the first seif, relatively straightforward. Now we're going to get into the weeds a little bit for seif bet. And for that, we need to first turn to a Gemara in Psachim, which is not going to bear directly necessarily on the main topic, but it's going to come up later when we see the Ramah's opinion. So Ruben, would you mind taking the Gemara in Psachim? He might be frozen. He's frozen. All right, Andres, can you take the Gemara in Psachim?
Yes, the one you sent in your. Yeah.
Yes.
אמר רבא בר אבא, אמר רב חייא, בר אשי, אמר שמואל, כל הכלים שנשתמשו בהן חמץ בצונן, משתמש בהן מצה, חוץ מן בית שאור, no.
Yep, you're good. Mm-hmm.
הואיל שחימוצו קשה. So they said that everything that you used with chametz, cold, you can use on the matzah. You can put on the matzah. Chutz mi beit seor. What is beit seor?
So beit seor is the place where the leaven is stored, right? So thinking about like sort of sourdough, the leavening agent, the starter, wherever that is sold, even if it's cold, you can't use it on Pesach because that's like hyper chametz.
I was wondering if it's because it's hyper chametz or because you tend to keep it in one place for a long time, and that might
Right. Well, I think those are both, meaning like, I think that's the explanation of this Hoel Sheikh Mitsu Kashet, right? It like really gets into it. And I also think even though there's not real heat, there is like an element of heat in a leavening process that happens naturally.
I want to push back on the heat thing because there's no more heat in a leavening process than there is in simply having food sit out on the counter. And so I think if you were to say like it's a heat issue, then you would also be concerned about heat when you, for example, have your cheese and your meat wrapped in one bundle.
Right.
Because you can proof yeast, you can have sourdough starter at room temperature. So.
Yeah, I think that is a fair edit. I don't think we're actually dealing with literal heat. I'm talking more like about the internal process. But more than that, I think it's just like, as Yavni said, that's where it lives, right? Like you can do cleaning, you can do whatever you need to do. It is like real chametz territory. And Andres, I appreciate that you actually emphasize. I don't know if you did this purposely, where you sort of emphasize the so in cold, because there are girsot of the Gemara that doesn't have that, which is really important. Even though the Rishonim and Achronim that we're going to deal with actually touch upon that. So again, just to keep this, I want you to keep this Gemara in the background, where theoretically you can have kalim that were used chametz, but as long as they were used for cold, you can presumably clean them out, and then you can use them on Pesach for your matzah. So I'd like us to turn to the Torah, and not the whole seif, just the end, where we're going to get the opinion of the Baal HaItur. So, it's the whole seif. Never mind. Okay, so it's the whole seif.
Wait, let me just can I just make a suggestion? Maybe looking at Rashi, maybe Beta Saor means kibbut. Maybe this is what you said, kavisha. In other words, it's there overnight. Rashi says it's the woman leaves it's like a wet, it's a sourdough starter kind of wet, oozy thing sitting overnight. Maybe it's like pickling.
Yeah. So Rav Nachum, I had the same thought, because he says shoheb belayla, or so I think it's the Rashi language there. And right, remember Rashi seems to think that just leaving overnight is enough, either for time to turn bad, or maybe even for kibush to happen as well, right?
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right. So thank you for that. Right. It's important. Again, regardless if it's krisha or not, the point is that there is a lach element to it. Is, I think, the crucial point here, where we're beyond just normal Yavesh purposes. So we are now going to the Torah, Seif Bet, and Josh, you good to read this one?
Yeah. Okay. כתב בעל העיטור, שמע מינה, כל מידי דבאי הדחה, כגון בשר היתר צונן בקערה של איסור צונן, אסור לכתחילה. דילמה אכיל בלא הדחה. ודווקא בשר מבושל, דליו אורחי בהדחה. אבל מידי דאורחי בהדחה, כגון בשר חי וכיוצא בו, שערי לכתחילה. So the Baal HaItur says, Shma mina, that anything that needs to be washed, as we said before, like kosher meat, cold kosher meat in a non-kosher pot, it's forbidden to put it in there lechatchila, because maybe you'll come to eat without hadacha if you're used to this. And this is only talking about things which aren't usually washed, but things, paradoxically, which are usually washed don't need to be washed.
Well, it's not that they don't need to be washed. It's that you're not going to run into the trap of not washing them, because regardless of Isra Beheter or Basar B'chalav, you're going to wash them anyway because they require to be washed.
So if you didn't rinse them for some reason, what does the Shara Lechatchila add?
the shari l'chachila is you can take a raw piece of meat, which you, before doing anything to it, regardless of its kashrut status, is you're gonna rinse it off because that's what you always do, right? You're allowed to slap that onto a non-kosher plate, cold plate. That's the shari l'chachila. So I think the Baal Yitor is actually doing a close reading of our Mishnah here, where I think that's what he means by the Shema Mina, where the Mishnah uses the word, the first Mishnah, not the one talking, that uses the word Shinagu Zeb Bazeb Mutarim, right? That's B'diavad language, right? Lechachila, you would not be in that situation. Doesn't quite connect to the first half of the sentence, which seems to be a lechachila case, but I think that that's sort of what's happening here. But bottom line, the Baal Yitor says lechachila, you should not be putting on cold, even if it's cold together, because you might forget and do hadacha. Yavni, do you have something to say?
Yeah, isn't that from the rak ubilvad shelo yihu nogim ze b'ze?
Right. So it's hard to know because the nogim zebazeh is like theoretically two pieces of food. The question is, would you be able to extrapolate that to kalim? Presumably, yes. But I think it's that entire phrase that the Baal Yitor is extrapolating from, right? You don't want to do this lechachila, but if it does happen, like this is what you do. And we're going to see, because of the Gemara and Pesachim that we saw, that this becomes a little dicey. So for that,
this is just a huge chumrah, no? Isn't he?
Chumrah.
He's making a huge chumrah because we were talking about food touching each other. That I can understand. But I mean, a plate. What is he assuming, that the plate is filthy? He gets a clean plate. Why would you need to do hadacha? And then there's a combined kula, huge kula, which is that if it is going to be a problem, like let's say really piece of cheese and really piece of meat. So what does he say? You can put your raw meat on cheese because, hey, you're going to wash the meat anyway. So that's like this kind of a kula also, that if it really is a problem, then mapitom, you can just rely on the fact that you normally wash things to then go ahead and l'chatchila create a problem.
Right. It's interesting though that that's the implication, right? Because he seems like he is only talking about, oh, you slap the meat on the plate, right? He doesn't say you slap the meat on the cheese. But right. I guess if you're right, if he's willing to draw a 1-to-1 ratio from a chumrah, then he actually has to take the kula at the same time.
Well, maybe that's the thing. Maybe he's saying, only because I made this chumrah will I then let you have this kula of doing it lechatchila. But then, but if he admits it's a chumrah, then I'd like him to explain where he invented this chumrah from. In other words, does he see it as a chumrah, or does he see it as a straight learning from the Mishnah? He sees it as a straight learning from the Mishnah. That is cool. I don't understand. And if it's a chumrah, I don't understand it where he got it from.
Right. Well, the fact that he's using lechachila language leads me to believe that it is a chumrah. Right. He uses the word lechachila, asur lechachila, dilma. Right. That's like that. The dilma thing is like indicates it's.
No, but he's implying that you're required to wash it. You're required 100% to wash it. The question is, can you put it there? And he's saying you better not to put it there because maybe you'll forget to wash it. But that doesn't mean that the putting it there is in other words, he's seeing a real event happening. That's the question. Is putting something on a clean plate an event? Or is it just an imaginary event that we make a chumrah about? He seems to be viewing it as a real event because he's saying you're required to wash it now. And maybe you'll forget.
Yeah, when I first read this, I really wanted to read it not as kara shel isur, like it's just it's a clean plate that once had isur on it, but rather like, I know this isn't how it ends up getting read, so I was sort of disappointed. But like kara shel isur, like a kara that has isur in it, but I don't think that's what it is, yeah.
Right. It's like in some ways it's more extreme than that because it's like not a big deal. It's a plate. Right. Great. So thank you for those comments, because they're going to feed in a little bit directly to what we're going to see in the Darchei Moshe. Joel, you are up. So this is Darchei Moshe Aleph.
All right. This is V'yesh Lakshot.
Yes.
Okay, great. V'yesh Lakshot. Dehai Amrinan Perak Kol Sha'a Klish Nishtamesh Bo Chametz. And right, mine has the V'yesh Gorsin Sonen. Mishtamesh Bo Matzah. V'kach Katav Atur or Achaim Siman Taf Nun Aleph. Imken Shma Minad Mutar Lishtamesh B'Sonen Bichli Isur Aflagav Delo Yadihu Lebesof. Right, and that so from there, right, you don't even need halacha at the end, right? V'lachen nireli delo asul lishtamesh bo ela basar v'chayotze bo de'ipe lachluchit aval devar yavesh kegon matzah bichli chametz share. All right, so first take, right, that this maybe the isur, the chumrah here is only for things that have, that are wet. But if it's a dry, matzah's dry, you put matzah on a chametz plate, not a problem, right? That the liquid has some sort of transferring power or some event potentially that happens. All right, but so
I would just add, don't think of our chametz, our matzah, which is crumbling, and therefore you have to think of their matzah, which was pizza-ish, and therefore nothing comes up.
Yeah. That's a good point, right? So it would be like in the way that if I put a piece of bread, well, not bread's not wrong. You put a piece of lapa on a plate, you wouldn't get any. V'tzarich v'shar lechalek ben chametz lishar yisurim. All right. So maybe there's a difference between chametz and everything else.
Why would there be a difference?
Great. Well, part of it might be that at the time you're doing it, the chametz is still mutar.
Heter bala, you're saying.
Yeah. So.
And there's another possibility is that maybe he's assuming that you wash them well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the Mishnah in Psachim is assuming you're washing them, or the Gemara is assuming you're washing them well. And it's only saying, but even so, it's asur.
Yeah.
If it's that kli, if it's that.
I will tell you, nothing in my house in the kitchen is ever cleaner than right before Pesach. So it's but so it's possible. And it is true. Right? You could also imagine that people are more careful. Like, if you're going to use chametz, if you're going to have a chametz plate, you're going to put matzah on before Pesach, right? That you would be very careful to wash it off in a way that you wouldn't necessarily in other cases.
It's wrapped in aluminum foil anyway. So.
Hey, that's also a good point. Yeah.
The matzah or the plate?
Yeah.
Everything.
But so all right. Where was I? Chalek ben chametz l'shar isurim. Ve'od nireh yesh lechalek ben davar shebala isur bechamim. Az asu yishmesh botzonen ked'ita lekaman siman kuf kaf aleph. Aval davar mishtamshim bo isur tzonen mutar lehaniach bo heter tzonen. Dumi dechametz umatzah. All right, so maybe it has to do with, well, what was, how did that thing, was it interact with, in this case, chametz, or maybe with isur or with halav or whatever it is? Did that plate have hot cheese on it once upon a time and now I'm putting meat on it? Or did it just, it's what I use for my cold cheese plate that I put out in front of my guests. And that might be different. It's in a dumi de chametz umatzah v'zeh hatirutz nir eli ikar. He says that seems to be what I think is really the right answer. Vayen la'el siman samach tet demutar lechotzonen belo hadacha bichli shemochim bo. Right, that's a whole nother issue of putting a cold food without a hadacha on a salting dish, a dish where you salt a meat on. So.
Great, thanks, Joel. So Darchei Moshe takes the Bali toward a task, which makes sense because we all had an issue with him anyway. So it's good to be in the same company as the Ramah, and he sort of provides because he challenges him from this Gemara, right? And he provides three distinctions between chametz or basically between our Gemara in Klulin and the Gemara in Pesachim. One is that there's a difference between dry cold and wet cold, in which case dry cold in the case of chametz doesn't need hadacha, but wet cold in the case of seeing what the itor is dealing with does require hadacha. Second distinction he brings is the difference between chametz and other isurim. Ramah says sarich iyun. We gave some rationales as to why that might be a difference, where we're a little bit more lenient in this case, ironically, with chametz than we are with shar isurim. And then the third rationale he gives is that, there's sort of a difference between hot storage and cold, or things that had been hot before versus things that had been cold before. So in the case of chametz, it's, oh no, we're dealing with things that have never interacted with heat. It's not a big deal, as opposed to the place that the Itur is dealing with, where even though at the moment it's sonen, it at one time had absorbed some sort of Isur via heat. And he comes down and says, this third one is the most compelling reason.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, of course.
But he did not attack the Bala Itur
Correct.
in the way that we did.
Correct. He says his question is, how does the Bala Itur reconcile with the Gemara? And he said how it's reconciled, but he does not hit it away. At least here.
In other words, he does see the Bala Itur as having a valid limud from Chulin, even though we were not clear about that.
Right. So he doesn't explicitly challenge the Bala Itur the way we do. But I think he creates a semi-okimta as to the range of what the Bala Itur is talking about. You read the Bala Itur, you could fit a billion different parameters into it. And what he's saying is, I just gave you three distinctions, and we should deal with this third distinction. So and this distinction is between the hot storage and cold storage. So now we know that, right, that like there might be a disagreement, in which case the Itur is like, oh, even if that Isur plate was fully cold, right, never interacted with hot, you wouldn't lechatchila be allowed to put the meat on it, right? While the Ramah would say, well, if it's never interacted with heat, then there's no issue. So I agree with you, Rav Nachman, but so it's not a full-on attack, but there is a bit of a limitation. And we're going to sort of see how that pans out right now. If we turn back into the Shulchan Aruch, where we see how the Mechaber and the Ramah deal with this relatively. So Ruben, can you take us on Seif Bet, please?
Sure, just give me 1 second.
Sure thing.
All right. Okay, Seif Bet. כל מידי דבעי הדחה, כגון להניח בשר היתר צונן בקערה של איסור צונן, אסור לכתחילה, דילמה האכיל בלא הדחה, ודווקא מבושל, דלאו הוכיח בהדחה, אבל מידי דאוכל בהדחה, כגון בשר חי וכיוצא בו, שהרי לכתחילה. It seems to be saying pretty much the same thing as the Torah, right? So everything that needs to be washed, yeah. So as long as we agree with that, I don't have to translate, unless you want me to.
I don't think there's a need. He basically pulls the language directly from him, and the Mechaber is like totally going with the Itur here. Now, importantly, read the Ramah, where we see the transformation from the Moshe Israel's opinion from the Darchei Moshe to here. I'll also add that he also takes on this Atar Chata, different formulation. We don't have time to get through everything, but go ahead for the Ramah.
So the Rama said, ודווקא דבר שיש בו לחלוכית קצת, אבל דבר יבש ממש, אם לא בעלה הכלי רק בצונן, מותר להניח בו דבר יבש, ולא הדחה כלל, ואין לקמן סימן קכ"ב. So he said, דווקא, like what we're talking about, is דווקא in something that has like a little moisture, I guess, but something that's truly dry. If the כלים לא בעלה הכלי רק בצונן, מותר להניח בו דבר יבש, בלא הדחה. But if the kili didn't swallow anything, I guess, it's permitted to put something dry on it, below הדחה כלל, without rinsing it whatsoever.
Great. So
it really sneaks in that condition that's like
yes,
actually a really
does.
big
All right,
deal.
Yavdi, please tell us what he sneaks in there.
The condition that the dish has to have never absorbed through heat the Yisur. Right.
Right. So this is sort of how, Rav Nachum's critique of like that original challenge, like sort of gets answered, because he does offer a slightly different opinion, or at least a more modified opinion. And I will say there's actually one big distinction here, well, not distinct, addition between here and the Darchei Moshe. Does anyone see what that is? In terms of the limitations that he offers here, as opposed to what he views
that the food itself has to be dry.
Right. If you read the Darchei Moshe, he gets 3 conditions, and at the end, he's like, oh, only worry about, sorry, he doesn't say that. He says condition 3 is Ikar, which presumably then you're not paying attention to 1 and 2, but here he sneaks in the Lachluchit component as well.
Well, there's a double.
So
in other words, it has to have be dry now and have been dry before. Right?
I don't know if it has to have been dry before. It couldn't have interacted with heat before.
Yeah, my sense is the lachluchit is the condition on the food now that you're going to eat on it, and the heat condition is on both how it got
right.
and how it.
Unless it was in there for 24 hours or overnight.
Or overnight, depending on who you ask. Exactly. Great. So now we're going to take a look at the Shach, who sort of pushes back on the Ramah here. There just happens to be on this Siman a bunch of really, really long Shachs, and we'd end up spending our entire time dealing with these really, really, really long Shachs. So this one I cut up in a total truncated way, does not reflect the text at all, but sort of gets the main points across, and that's why I posted it directly into our document. Tikva, are you there?
I had to reopen the document because I took the old one. Sorry, so I'm not actually there right now.
All right, we'll come back.
It's on the same document, right?
Yeah, it's the same document that was sent out in the email.
I printed like the one you sent before you.
Yes, perfect. Okay, yeah. This was a late edition. All right, that's fine. So, Isaac, I think we are back to you. Would you like to take the Shach?
I can give it a go. I also tried to read the whole thing, but let's see how it goes from your doc.
It would be on that forever, so we're just gonna do with this.
Totally. I certainly was. The דווקא חולה. יש לחלק בין אם רחץ הכלי תחילה היטב, או לא רחצו. דאם רחצו תחילה היטב, ודאי שווה. Okay, so there's a difference between whether or not you washed the dish well in the first place or whether you didn't, and if you washed it well, then of course it's permissible. אבל כל דבריו מתחילתן ועוד סופן אינן מובנים לי.
So this is referring to the Ramah.
Yeah, so the Ramah is only talking about l'chatchila, and I don't know about what happens. The Ad Sofan,
like all his...
No, this is saying is the Ramah doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
That's what the Shach is saying, right? I lost it. Where is it? But all his words from the beginning until the very end, they're not understandable to me.
Okay, cool. Umashma dilada'atam, אם נבלע חמץ בחמין, דמותר להשתמש בהם מצה בצונן, דמה נבלע על ידי צונן או על ידי חמין. ואף על גב דבש"ס במסכת עבודת כוכבים, מחלק זה תשמישו בחמין וזה תשמישו בצונן, היינו להשתמש בהן היתר חמין או כבוש וכיוצא בו, אבל נשתמש בהן היתר צונן בשיטה דאין חילוק. וכך היא משמע לחדיה מדברי הרשב"א בחידושיו, שם זה אפילו אם נשתמש בכלי דבר איסור בחמין, מותר לאכול בו. אחר כך צונן לך בלא הדחה. כלל, לא הכלי ולא המאכל, אלא שמקנח הכלי יהיה שם. וגם במי שחילק במאי דברים אמרו.
בדרכי משה.
בדרכי משה, sorry, thank you. בין היתר לך ליבש, לא יצא ידי חובת באור הדברים, שהרי הרשב"א שם מתיר להדיה לאכול בצונן לך, אין שם. מיהו, כל זה בדרך ארעי, אבל אם בא להשתמש בהן דרך קבע, אפילו צונן אסור, גזירה שמו ישתמש בהם חמים. Okay. So basically, if what the Ramah is trying to say is that if the dish absorbed chametz that was hot, that it's permissible to make matzah, cold matzah in it. But like, what would nivla through cold even mean? Versus, or like, where am I getting the fact that there's a distinction between cold and hot absorption?
Right, after it had presumably cooled down already.
Right. So even in the Shas, they make a distinction between, in Avodah Zarah, they make a distinction between working with like something that's, or making something that's cold in the dish versus making or using something that's hot in the dish. And so if you're using hot header or header that is like pickled or something like that, then like it's okay. Or it's the same, but or there's a difference. But it seems like if you're using cold heter, there shouldn't be a difference. And so we get this from the Rashba, that even if you used hot isur in a kli, it's permissible to eat afterwards. You can eat wet cold heter from it without rinsing it. Without rinsing either the kli or the food. You just need to wipe the dish. And so then there's also a difference in the Darchei Moshe between heter that's wet versus dry. And he didn't do a good enough job like digging into this and explaining it. Because the Rashba says that it's permissible to eat the wet, cold food. And all of this is only if it's sort of like a once-off and it's not like the usual thing that you do. But if it's something that you do regularly, you're like, I'm always going to use this treif dish with heter food. Then even if you're putting cold food on it, it's aser, and that's a gezerah so that you don't start to use hot heter with this treif dish.
Great, nice job, Isaac. It's a hard shach, even if it's a shorter version. So you did a really good job with it. So, sort of to summarize, the shach does not like what the Ramah said. He seems to be inventing distinctions that didn't previously exist. And I didn't bring them all here, but Shach quotes Rishon after Rishon after Rishon, who like doesn't draw these distinctions and seems to flatten out like there's no difference between hot and cold here at that point. So I would say the main takeaways from this Shach, which Isaac just read, is that first of all, assuming a good cleaning happened, right? You can slap on your kosher meat onto a non-kosher dish that had absorbed heat previously, right? So first of all, that goes against the Ramah, who says you can't do that. And in some ways, it also goes against the Itur, because the Shach is talking lechatchila, even though at the end he talks, we'll get to the end, but he's sort of talking lechatchila here, and that would definitely not fly according to the Torah. So that's one big distinction. Again, previously hot Isur plate, the plate it's clean, you wiped it down, totally clean, it's cold now, you slap your piece of meat on there, there's no issue. And then importantly, and this makes sense given the first shach we read, that he says, look, if both are dry both of them are dry, you definitely don't need hadacha, right? Which comes directly out of the first shach that we read when he quoted the Bach. And then the third important point before we get to this Arai Keva piece is, and I don't necessarily think it came out so well in the excerpt that I gave you, is kinuach, really good kinuach, is the equivalent of hadacha, which is a slight edit to what we were saying before, where it's like, oh, you need wet to combat wet. But if you do a really good thorough cleaning, you actually don't need to apply full-blown hadacha. So those are the main takeaways from the shach. And of course, as Isaac elucidated at the end, this is lechatchila, but as long as you don't do it all the time. Meaning, like, I don't know, you're at an Airbnb. Like, this is what I'm imagining, right? You're at an Airbnb. You know the plates. Like, there's no real way that you would consider them to have not interacted with cham or anything. But like, you slap your piece of meat. It's arai. You're going to be super careful. But like, to do this every day at your own home, you should not do, because that's gonna lead to some troubles.
Well, and that's actually the source for us having separate dishes.
Right. Because theoretically, there's no issue. Right.
Otherwise, theoretically, right, you could just use the same dishes if you would wash them.
Only if you're only eating cold, though.
That's true. You're right.
Right. But I would add the distinction between, Iker halacha, and then the other thing I would call is policy. Policy keeps you safe from all sorts of things. And if you have a policy, you don't have to worry. So the policy is not even a matter of being machmer. Being machmer would be almost like, in every case, you're kind of judging. Don't judge it. Here's a policy. You follow the policy, you're safe. But Meikar Adin, and therefore Meikar Adin, you can use as Noam says, in a Airbnb or staying with your uncle and aunts or something like that.
Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, I think policy is the right way, because it's not like he also doesn't use the term like he doesn't really use the term like lechatchila b'diavad machmir or mekil. He just says like this is how you should act, which presumably if you did it all the time, assuming you didn't make any mistakes, you'd be okay. But realistically that's not going to happen. Joel, go ahead.
No, I was just saying this is actually, I can't remember whose house it was. It was some relatives or something, and I didn't know which were the meat, bowls and which were the milk bowls, and I was like, I'm eating something quiet. It probably was ice cream, and it was like, all right, so one off is not going to do any damage, and versus and there's even a fake, right? It could have been I was eating off the right bowls and I just didn't know it. So, but I feel good about
like
that.
But even in like my own home, right? Like, you might be baking something, cooking something. It's like, the bowl right next to you, it's so convenient, right? Like it's, it's said, it's like, there's no issue about it. But then like, there's that thing. It's like, you know what? I'm just going to do the extra step and grab the correct bowl, even though like Mikar Dean, like it would have been fine. Yeah. Great.
Well,
all right. Yeah.
I would just add on that basis. I once heard from Professor Chaim Soloveitchik. He said it in Shir that his mother, Dr. Soloveitchik, was in the hospital. They brought her back right before Pesach. But before they brought her back, the day before, he's sitting with his father, and they said, who's going to kasher the kitchen for Pesach? So the Rav said, well, we can either start working now, or we could sit down and learn for 2 hours and figure out Me'ikar Hadin. So they did that. They bring her home. Erev Pesach, she walks into the kitchen. This is coming back from the hospital. According to Professor Chaim, she like almost fainted. And she says, I'm not stepping foot in this kitchen the entire Pesach, which she did not, because the policy had been, now I'm intervening with my word, the policy had been violated. Yeah.
That is the greatest story, specifically because it's like, because Professor Salveggio wrote Rapture and Reconstruction. It's just like, it's an amazing thing when you put it in context with that. But thank you for sharing. Okay, we are going to quickly do Seif Gimel. We're just gonna look at the Seif because it's pretty straightforward, not look at any Nosei Kalim. And then we will take a break. So Yavni, up to you.
צריך להיזהר שלא ייגע בשר בלחם שאם ייגע בו אסור לאכלו עם גבינה, וכן ייזהר שלא ייגע בו גבינה שאם ייגע בו אסור לאכלו עם בשר. So if you have a third party, something part of bread, you should be careful not that it doesn't touch meat, because once it's touched meat, you can't eat that bread with cheese and vice versa.
Right. So so I think you're technically right that like it's a third party parv, not either. But I think it's important. I think he specifically mentions bread because you eat bread
with
like
both.
Easily enough. Meaning you grab the loaf, or right. I think it's just like a very transferable entity. So we have to be extra careful about bread, because theoretically, right, with something parv, right, we learned the previous simanim, right, you just wash it off and then you're good to go. And then you can go eat it with the opposite. I think there's something specific about bread because of the confusion factor that you have to be extra careful about it.
That makes sense.
Okay, so we are going to break. It is 2:58. We'll come back at 3:03, and then we'll take care of the rest of the Siman. Thanks, everyone. I saw your, he asked me, would you say based on the shach, we could just ignore bet? I think mostly, except for when the food touches something that was hot. Meaning when I think the shach is saying that there is no issue that when the food touches something that is now cold that was once hot, that's fine. You can do that lechachila, assuming you do hadacha. I think he still has that limitation. So that's where I think Seif bet is still in play. Otherwise, I think not.
But also, Noam, isn't it still in play when it's actually two pieces of food together? Like the shach doesn't seem to.
No, I guess, yeah. I guess that's more Seif Aleph.
Is that Aleph or is that bet?
Aleph is the food, and then bet is the plate.
Oh, you're right. It's only the plate. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Right.
So.
Right.
Well, right. I guess bet is like stating a general principle, and then it's the example that bet brings that's problematic. Am I reading that right?
Yes, I think so. Rav Nachum, did you disagree? Do you think bet is totally out? I think there's still that small room for it to hang on to.
When you say hot food touching cold,
not hot. No, it's cold food touching a plate that is now cold. Obviously, because it was hot, be problematic. But that food did have blio. No.
Well, I don't. If the plate, no, I think it's irrelevant whether the plate had previously touched hot or cold, according to the shach, and therefore even a wet food on it is not going to be a problem. That's why I think really there is nothing relevant in bet in the end.
All right, then bet's totally out. Well, sorry, it's not that. Yeah.
I didn't look. Are there achronim who push back against the shach on this?
From what
I didn't look either.
So from what I saw, the Taz has a slightly different reading than the Ramah, but not a much to change it substantially.
I think the shach proved his point, and I think that the Bala Itter really needs to explain himself.
Well, it's really easy for the Shach to prove his point because he has an army of Rishonim who are with him. So that's always helpful. Okay, great. All right, so we are going to try to go through these last Siman Seifim in the time that we have left. We'll see if we're successful. So we are going to Dalet, and we are going to reconnect with our good friends Tata Gavar and Nila Gavar, which we had last seen when we were doing Easter Beheter and I believe Coupe. Could be. So we're going to start off with this Gemara from Psachim. Psachim's getting a lot of love today. Asher, up to you.
איתמר, חם לתוך חם, דברי הכל אסור, צונן לתוך צונן, דברי הכל מותר. So it's said, something hot going into something hot, everybody agrees it's asur. Something cold going into something cold, everybody agrees it's mutar. Cham letoch sonen, sonen letoch cham. Rav amar ila gavar, Shmuel amar tach gavar. But if you have hot that falls into cold or cold that falls into hot, Rav says we go according to whatever's on top, and Shmuel says we go according to whatever on the bottom. Tanya, hold on.
Sorry, there's an ellipses here.
Sorry, my computer's also being a little funky on me right now. Tanya, Kavte de Shmuel, Cham letoch cham, asur. Remind me, Kavte.
Kavate, according to a Braita was taught according to Shmuel's opinion.
Okay, so according to Shmuel, hot that goes in the hot, it's asur. V'chen sonen shenatan letoch cham, asur. So based on Shmuel, if we're saying that whatever's on the bottom is what determines, then hot in the hot obviously is asur, and if cold falls into hot, meaning the hot's on the bottom, then it's also asur.
Right. Again, the Braita is not based on Shmuel. The Braita is being brought to support Shmuel's position, which is
right. I'm saying
based
on what Shmuel said, which is that that it goes according to whatever's on the bottom. Then if tzonen falls into cham, then it's also asur. The cham letoch tzonen, the tzonen letoch tzonen, madiach. But if it's if hot falls into cold, or if cold falls into cold, you just rinse it. Cham letoch tzonen madiach. And hot and cold madiach. Kevan dechamu.
So that you're gonna want to read cham letoch tzonen madiach as a question.
Okay. Cham letoch tzonen madiach. Kevan dechamu. Ademeka le iefsha delo bala purta. Because it's not possible you're going to say it didn't absorb anything. Klipa miuniva niven. Ela ema cham letoch tzonen kolef. Tzonen letoch tzonen madiach. Okay, I understand all the words, and I sort of lost myself.
Right. So the Braita has this concluding phrase of cham letoch tzonen v'tzonen letoch tzonen madiach. Right, hot into cold and cold into hot. We just wash off. The Gemara asks, cham letoch tzonen madiach. What are you talking about? You when cham falls into sin, you just rinse it off. Kevan dechamhu ad mekar le efshar delo bala porte klipa miha nivaye. Right, since it's hot, it's impossible that a little that it wouldn't got heated up a little bit, meaning absorption would have been caused at least at a minute amount. Klipa miha nivaye. At least you got to require klipa in a case of cham letoch tzonen. So the Gemara answers ela ema. Perhaps many brighter, who knows? Cham letoch tzonen kolef, tzonen letoch tzonen madiach. So actually, in a case of cham letoch tzonen, we do klipa, and it's only when two things are cold where we do mediach, where we wash. All right, keep going, Asher. One more brighter.
Where am I? Tanya idach, right?
Tanya idach, right?
Okay, Tanya idach. Basar roteach shenafal letoch chalav roteach, v'chen tzonen shenafal letoch cham asur. So another writer says if hot meat falls into hot milk, or cold meat falls into hot milk, it's asur. If hot meat falls into cold milk, or if cold meat falls into cold milk, you rinse it off and we're good. So you say hot falls into cold, you just rinse it off. Why? How are we saying that? Because it's hot. Because it's impossible. So now we're just going back to what we already read.
The exact same challenge as before, right?
Right. So it's the same thing. It's like you can't say it wouldn't absorb at least a little bit. So you have to at least have klipa. So instead you say So you should say, if hot meat falls into cold milk, or if hot falls into cold, then you do klipa, and if cold falls into cold, then you just rinse it off.
Great, amazing. So at core of this Gemara is we've got a dispute between. Well, first of all, let's talk about the known things, right? It's for sure hot and hot asor, cold and cold madiach, and now what happens when you do tzonen l'toch cham or cham l'toch tzonen? So you got a machloka between Shmuel and Rav. Rav says ilah gavar, so whatever the status of the upper thing, whether it's hot means it's forbidden, it's cold madiach, right? Or cold, we'll put that on the side. And then Shmuel says hatagavar. So everything that is based on the bottom is what continues. We cite two braitot in accordance with Shmuel, supporting his opinion. And out of the discussion of those braitot, we learn that yes, it is true, tzonen b'toch tzonen is madiach, but you have cham l'toch tzonen, you still do need to do a klipa, because again, we're doing according to Shmuel, tatagavar. So Rashi, I just like this Rashi because I think it sums up basically all the Rishonim on the topic, and also like cuts against our normal grain of psia for a moment, where he writes, Ushmuel amar tatagavar, helkach cham l'toch zonen mutar b'tzonen l'toch cham asor. So therefore, when hot falls into cold, it's permitted. Again, not permitted in the sense that you just need to do a klipa and then it is permitted. And tzonen l'toch cham asor. And then cold into hot is forbidden. Ve'af agav dehilchata kerat b'isurei. And even though in every other area, in every other place, we say that in cases of a machloka between Shmuel and Rav and Isra Heter, we say the halacha is like Rav. Here, the halacha of Shmuel, because there are two braitot that are taught like his opinion, which we just read. So bottom line, Tata Gavar seems to win the day, and Rashi, I really think here is I'm going to say he's channeling the other Rishonim because the other Rishonim came after him, but he's representative of the Rishonim's opinion that the halacha follows Shmuel in terms of Tata Gavar. So one more piece of background is we got to turn to this Tosafot, which is also on the Gemara. So Josh, I believe it is your turn.
Tosafot. תן אידך בשרותיך. תמה, התו למה לי להביאה? Why is this second Braita brought?
Right, like why do we need two Braitot to two more Shmuel? One would have presumably been enough.
ואומר רבינו תם, דקמשמע לן, דאפילו חלב שרי. דאף על גב דחם לתוך צונן, באי קליפה. בדבר שיכול לעשות קליפה, בדבר דלא שייך קליפה, כמו בחלב, מותר. So Rabbeinu Tam says that it comes to teach that even milk is permitted, because even though we usually say that cham l'toch tzonen, hot and cold, you need a klipa, you could think that that's only in things which can be peeled, and something which can't be peeled, like milk, is permitted. מתעלות כתני איסור גבי חלב, כדקתני קליפה גבי בשר. Since it's not,
Right.
go on, help me.
Okay, sorry. No. So that exactly what you were saying, you might think, which you indicated was wrong. No, that's exactly what you should think, right?
Yeah.
The second brightest teaching, in fact, you only take a klipa from things that you can take a klipa from, basar, but milk, which you can't take a klipa from, it's shari. There's nothing to be done with that. So in a case of a hot piece of meat falling into cold milk, you do the klipa of the meat, and then the milk is fine. Nothing to do that, according to Rabbeinu Tam. And that's why that second Braitas brought to make this point. Okay, but then there's a second answer. We're not a second answer. It's more of a challenge to Rabbeinu Tam.
It's Yoel ben something?
Yitzhak ben Ar.
חולק בזה, there's a disagreement, מצריך 60 כדי קליפה. So he needs, so there's another opinion that in chalav, which can't be peeled, you need 60, which corresponds to the klipa.
Right. It's sort of like saying you really do need to take klipa, but because it's impossible to take a klipa from milk, because like, what are you going to be kolef? Well, we need to take care of that, so we're just going to throw shishim in there. So we have a machloka between Rabbeinu Tam and the Riva as to what we're supposed to be doing with that milk of a case of hot that falls into cold milk.
I'm not sure it's exactly that you need to take, that it's like instead of taking a klipa so much as like we have some ta'ovet going on, and therefore like and the reason why it's like 60 against the klipa of the meat, presumably, because that's where the isul happened. We had like, that's where the basar b'chalav is, and then so because that was in the milk, that we need to batal that in the milk, right?
Right. I think you're right, but I think the counterpoint is what happens when you have a hot piece of meat fall on a cold piece of cheese.
Right. Well, in that case, there's less mixing, presumably, because it is a solid thing, so it only goes a klipa deep. That's the idea. Whereas with the milk, it really got mixed in. That's how I would. Is that? Because then you don't need 60 because right.
Or you could say a klipa worth of milk, like this milk directly surrounding the meat, absorbed meat flavor. And so now you have basar b'chalav, that much of it, and so the rest of the milk has to butter. I don't know if they're making.
No, but then you could say, oh, you need to take out a klipa worth of the milk. Well,
you can never get the right klipa then, right?
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yes. Yeah.
So
right. Right. It seems that the shishim here is in replacement of the klipa that you really want to take, but you can't. Ravlandis.
Yeah, I want you to explain it to me more. Shishim sounds like, as a fallback position, it's such an extreme fallback position. I mean, that you need shishim. So that leads me to ask you, which I was going to ask you before, is klipa a kula or is klipa a chumrah?
Klipa to me is a kula, meaning
a kula on what? In other words, a kula
on the sense that we could say, oh, they touched, there's a little bit of heat transfer, get rid of the whole thing, right? The fact that you can do a klipa saves the rest of the dish.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And if you transfer that to the case of the milk, I think going from klipa to shishim is extreme. The problem is we don't have, you can correct me, but I don't think we really have anything in between.
In other words, there's no other, unless you would look at klipa as a chumrah. No, that wouldn't work either. So okay, I think that's fine. I'm fine with what you said.
Well, Rav Lennis, I think maybe though, right? The Rabbeinu Tam sees klipa here as a chumrah on doing nothing, right? Versus the Rivas sees it as a kula on the whole thing is just a sur.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be the machloket between the two of them going on. So
okay, help me one more time. For the Riva, as you explain it, what's the penetration?
The Riva says, klipa, we're being makil on the fact that we could have just said the whole thing was asur, right? That we're saying, well, it didn't make it all the way. So that's and therefore, if you can't do klipa, you need bitul. And then Rabbeinu Tam says, no, klipa is just like, that's a chumrah. The truth is, like, mikar din, you don't need to do anything. And
it's also a chumrah in the sense that if the quantities are such that it would be batel, like if a hot piece of meat fell on a small amount, a very small amount of cold milk, it's still not batel because like it's localized, so you still have to be kolef. Whereas like,
but you right now are taking klipa really seriously. I mean, in other words, that's where the penetration is.
right.
If you say so therefore, if you say the penetration is, to the klipa, then taking a klipa is just mikar din, you're just taking care of it. If you have uncertainty about it, then that gives you if you have uncertainty, then that just then you talk about kula or chumrah. Okay, that's enough for me. So, but sum it up. So for Rabbeinu Tam,
Right.
klipa is what?
Rabbeinu-
For Riva, klipa is what?
Well, this is Joel's Kiddush, so
Okay,
if he
Joel.
wants to, if he wants to say
Joel played with it because he heard it before also. So probably. So how do you see it, Joel?
yeah, no, I definitely didn't make this up. But no, and I think there is that third option that klipa is just klipa. It's not a chumrah, not a kula. It's a thing. It's a real thing. But but I do think that at least to Rabbeinu Tam, klipa is a chumrah, and when you're not, when it's afshar, but it's not afshar, like we don't hold it. But the Riva at least thinks it's a real thing, and maybe even thinks it's just we're being makil about something where the whole thing should be asur. And in that case, if you can't take a klipa, then you actually have a problem unless you have shishim.
We may have had real penetration.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
There is a reason to say it. Rabbi Akiva Eger says that.
Oh, we're gonna get there.
Okay, sorry.
That's the punchline. Wait.
Yeah, no, we're gonna get there. Don't worry. I don't generally go so deep into the Achronim, but then I saw this. I'm like, I have to bring it. So awesome. Okay. So, but before we get to the good old Rabbi Akiva Eger, we're gonna take a look at how the Shulchan Aruch paskins here. And Ruben, we are up to you, Seif Daled.
Oh, sorry, just give me 1 second. Something just came up with work. I just have to find the right place.
Oh,
So we're in the Shulchan Aruch Seif Daled?
yes.
כן, בשר וחלב רותחים שהתערבו יחד, ואפילו בשר צונן לתוך חלב רותח, או חלב צונן לתוך בשר רותח, הכל אסור. משום דתת הגבר, אבל חלב רותח שנפל על בשר צונן, או בשר רותח שנפל לתוך הצונן, קולף הבשר ושאר הבשר מותר. ובמקום, ובמקום שהבשר צריך קליפה, אם לא קלפוהו, ובשלו כך מותר בדיעבד. והחלב מותר כולו, ואם נפלו זה לתוך זה צוננים, מדיח הבשר ומותר. So the Shulchan Aruch is bringing forward the following scenario. If we have meat and milk, which are like hot, that got mixed in together, even in the case where the meat is cold, and it fell into hot milk, or the opposite, where you have cold milk that fell onto like hot meat, everything is asur because we go according to Shmuel that we go like that the bottom one is stronger. But in the case where you have hot milk that fell onto cold meat, or the opposite where you have hot meat that fell onto cold milk, all you have to do is to like peel off the meat, and the rest of the meat is permitted. So you just like take off a little bit of the meat, and the meat is permitted. והחלב מותר כולו, and the milk is permitted totally. And if ואם נפלו זה לתוך זה צוננים, so if they fell into another while they were both cold, מדיח הבשר ומותר. All you have to do is rinse off the meat, and it's permitted.
Great, thank you. So first of all, Shulchan Aruch clearly rules like Shmuel, because that was like given from what Rashi was, that was going to happen, obviously. But between Rabbeinu Tam and the Riva, who does he rule like?
Rabbeinu Tam.
Yeah, he holds like Rabbeinu Tam. So I will make a quick addition that the version of the Tosafot that I gave you is Rabbeinu Tam. If you look at the Torah and the Beit Yosef, it's somehow the Ri, which is not so surprising given the fact that they are often quoted in the Tosafot. But yes, he holds like Rabbeinu Tam, that the milk is mutar. And again, we're gonna get to that Rabbi Akiva Eger later, but if you look at the Ramah of Makom Shabasar Sarich Klipa Im Lo Kalfuhu Vishlo Kach Mutar B'Diavad indicates that it's a chumrah, because at least according to the Ramah, the fact that you cook it later and then everything's all good means that it was probably a chumrah to begin with, at least according to this Ramah. So that's just something interesting to point out. So the story does not end there. The Taz and the Shach are not so comfortable with the fact that the Shulchan Aruch rules like the Rabbeinu Tam, and they seek to bring back the Riva. So Joel, can you read Taz Zayin? You're not going to read the whole thing. I'll tell you when to stop. Okay.
Okay, I'll just start going. Here we go.
You'll go for a little bit.
All right. Chalav mutar kulo. Uvetor hevi dat riva shetzarich sheyeh bechalav shishim neged haklipa shene'asar mimenu v'chatav maharei behagat shari dura afal gav debishar duchte ein klipa oseret chaverta afil im haklipot probably shamen, but shuman, or the klipot are maybe of fat v'chule mitam de ein koach lene'asar v'makom she'ein hayisur yachol elech sham. Ve'achinami ein tama basar bechol hachalav afilu hachi tzarich shishim. All right, so there's a whole push against the Riva here is, where normally we have a sense that when you have like a klipa, we don't say that thing penetrates into everything else, right? But here we actually do say you need shishim. Why? Kevan de davar lahu mitarev yachad, right? Because this isn't like a bunch of layers of fat. Here we're not only talking about klipa, liquids get all mixed up, right? Ve'yired dehachi nahug lechumra, v'lo ke'arosh ad kan l'shono. And so it seems like that the practice is lechumra, not like the rosh. His practice is to be machmer about this. All right. Ve'Shulchan Aruch pesak ke'arosh, dehainu keri v'Rambam she'ein tzarich shishim neged haklipa, uve'iser v'heter klal kaftet, posek lekula ke'arosh. B'shem Maharam, probably Maharam Rotenberg, shebekama mekomot sheyitzrichu chachamim klipa, all right, ubishluhu kach below klipa. Sorry, my Shulchan Aruch has a word that's a letter missing there. Afilu ein shishim neged klipa, afilu ein shishim neged klipa mutar, afilu lechatchila delo yitzrichu chachamim klipa ela mitzad chumra lechatchila ad kan l'shono ubichlal ad kan l'shono. Okay. Uvichlal lamed vav katav, next page, lehefech de kara hanaseret kedei klipa oseret ad shishim neged haklipa. All right, so this is it seemed in one case that it was just like we said, just a klipa, just a chomra be'alma, and so if you can't do it, you can't do it. But here, right, that you have a dish that makes something asur, an amount of klipa, right? It can. If there's not 60-1, it can against the klipa that can osir the whole thing. Right? That doesn't sound like that sounds like the riva again. V'chata b'tarat chatat the bichlal lamed vav him ladat riva, exactly. V'hu dachuk meod shelo uzkar sham mizeh sholech ladat riva, right? And it doesn't make sense if that follows the riva, because nobody follows the riva. It sounds like. So adarabba katav devarav lipsak halacha bistam. Right, and there's no. This is the stam halacha, not in the name of the riva. All right, so we got to solve this. Tamihani amashikatav. I was makatav amashikatav mahari b'shem harosh lekula sharer rosh havi shtei deot beperak kol basar v'lo hichriya. Right. So how do we say that the rosh rules lekula? He brings both opinions. He doesn't make a distinction between the two. He doesn't rule like one of them. So,
right, so I'm gonna stop you there. we're not actually doing the meat of this Taz because we're going to see some of the work in the Shach. The reason I had you read all that, Joel, is to say that like the Rabbeinu Tam, that whole position has like some good yichus, meaning there are lots and lots of people who hold by it. The more lenient opinion again, and he's gonna take for the rest of the time. He's gonna say how the Rosh doesn't really hold it, but like the pshat of the Rosh is that he does. He clearly holds like it. And the reason I set this all up for you is because towards the end, he says, "Ken yesh lanu lifso kiriva l'hachmir ubekama mikamot ba'inan shishim nega klipa." The Taz sort of concludes saying, "No, actually, we're going to hold like the riba." Again, we don't really have time to go through the whole give and take, but I do want to emphasize that even though the Taz goes this route and the Shach heads up also goes the same route as the Riva, the Rabbeinu Tam's position has like a lot to stand behind. But now we're going to go ahead and do that work a little bit more in the Shach because he takes on the Ramah a little bit here and an explanation of why he holds like the Riva. So Tikva, can you read Shach Chet?
Yeah.
Thank you.
צריך עניין זה התוספות והגט הנאצר, דיבר מסל אם יש, בהגהת השירים מהריח בשמרי והמרדכי והאגודה, שם כתבו דייר שנמלך בגט הנאצר, ונתבשל צריך אחר כך שישים נגד הקליפה, שנאסר תחילה במליחה. וכן כתוב הגוד סימן א', קע"ח, בשם מהריל על עוף שנתבשל בלא חתיכת ורידין, דצריך שישים גם נגד הקליפה, שנעשה תחילה במליחה. So I'm not actually sure the second case with the oath, what the details are, but sorry, he's bringing these two cases.
Right. So before he gets to the oath, he talks about the Gid Hanasheh.
Yeah. So the first case is where you have the thigh, right, and you're salting it with the Gid Hanasheh still in it, and then you cook it. You need 60 against the klipa because it's already a serve from the malicha.
Right.
Right. And then, sorry, what's the second case with the oath?
So the second case of the oath is where you cook the oath, but you did not get rid of the forbidden tendons that you would take out otherwise, but you still need shishim neged them, neged the klipa that is there. So it's a similar case to the yarech of the Gid Hanasheh, but just giving it a case of oath which a different Rishon dealt with.
Right, and so in just his point here is that you do need the shishim.
Right, he's citing a couple of Rishonim here who like say, oh, wait, with the thigh and the Gid Hanasheh, right, and they get cooked together. You need shishim neged haklipa, right, which is not obviously what Rabbeinu Tam says, right? That's the point. Like, an entirely different case, but you're talking about a klipa, and yet we need shishim against them.
Mm-hmm. But it just seems like a slightly different logic. So I just want to make sure that I was getting that.
Right. So the cases are different because we're dealing with a different type of isur, but the principle of needing shishim times the klipa should presumably be the same across isurim.
Okay. Umro Beit Yosef Siman Chafet Sifdale Bestam V'chein Habach Sham V'chein Katuv Habach B'Pishitot Siman Yod Sifhei Gebei Shochet Pesachin Shel Ovek Kochavim Kolaf. Sorry, I'm not sure what that stands for. Kolaf B'Yod Hei.
Beit HaShchita.
Beit HaShchita, right. The feeling the avad asur hatapshil kadin shel basar shinbashel belok klipa ad kan lashon. And also in this case, where we have a knife, we're shacking with a knife that's used for over the kochavim, that you need klipa bidi avid, even bidi avid on that area that was shacked with it. Sorry, I think.
Right, you need right. You got it. So you still need the klipa there, right? And you can pick up v'nireh delo kamar harav.
Okay. בנראה דלא כמהרב דמקום שצריך קליפה ובשלו הוא, ולא קליפה דמותר בדיעבד. אלא דומה דהכה דחלה מותר מתמד. Right, so it doesn't seem in those cases that he's requiring klipa, that require klipa, that when they're cooked without klipa, that it's mutter b'di'avad.
Right, he's having an issue with the Ramah because the Ramah says need klipa and then you don't do klipa and then it gets cooked with something else. It's totally fine. But here the Shach is saying, wait a minute, I just said to you a case where that's wrong. Like even if you didn't take the klipa, it's a big problem.
Right. Okay. וכתבו התוספות והראש ושאר הפוסקים זה לא שייך בקליפה, דהיינו שהוא דבר הנבלע והקליפה נתערבה. וכרגע אם נתבשל הבשר בלא קליפה ונמלא בעניין דאינו מחירו שלא שייך בקליפה מותר בדיעבד, בהשתניחא דכתב סתם מותר בדיעבד דאי במכרו. Havale the parish the klipa.
Nihabai.
Nihabai, sorry. Right, so you're saying the other poskim who do acquire the klipa, sorry, that don't require the klipa, this is a case where it's gotten mixed up already, and you can't tell. Right, you can't. It's already been cooked. And so you can't distinguish what the klipa would be.
Right.
And so you can't recognize it. And so therefore they don't, it's mutter b'di'avad.
Right.
So
only in a case of where it's recognized.
Sorry. So only in a case where it's not recognized, right?
Sorry, right. Oh, sorry. You're right. Only in a case where it's not recognized. Not discernible.
Right. So if it's still recognizable, you would just cut it off, but if it's not recognizable, you don't need it. כן מה שכתוב בסעיף ע"ב, אבל כנתבשל והיינו מחירו בעניין דשייך בקליפה צריך 60. So, but if you still can recognize it, you would need 60. So sorry, why is it that you wouldn't just cut off the klipa? It's saying you need 60 because the klipa is considered like Isser against the rest of the food?
Well, no, lechachila, you would in fact cut off the klipa. It's what happens now that you have not done so. Where the Ramah seems to give this blanket statement where it's, oh, you didn't do so, it gets cooked, you're good to go, b'di'avad, we're fine. Where here the Shach is bringing several cases where that only applies in a very certain case. Right, everyone agrees that lechachila you need to take the klipa.
Right.
This is now only after the fact. Since I am looking at the time, I just want to skip to the end of this Shach, where he says ulafiza ein lahakel b'makom demakiro. In a case where you actually recognize that you shouldn't be stringent, you shouldn't be lenient. B'shaya klipa, and the klipa matters, meaning not like the Ramah who says don't worry about it. V'o dehada v'lavachi mehari marshal perak kafhe sif ayin pasku kiriva dafil b'chalav sarich shishin again klipa v'gam terchata klal kaf gimel din hey machmir afil b'chalav b'makom she'ein hefsed kol kaf yen sham. So he concludes two important points. One, Tikva, thanks for reading. You did the legwork for us. But based on that, he concludes with two important points. First of all, the Ramah is not necessarily correct in the way we're supposed to read him here in the Shulchan Aruch on the Mapah, that like, oh, klipa wasn't taken, you throw it in, it's fine, you're good to go b'di'avad. That's only in a case of Eino Makiro, but in a case of Makiro, it is still Asor. You can't be lenient, except perhaps in a case of Hefsed Meruba. And then the second point he brings is that we hold like the Riva. So both the Shach and the Taz holds like the Riva against the Shulchan Aruch. And then the Shach also has this additional machloket with the Ramah about what happens when you don't take the Klipa. And now, though, there is an issue with the Shach still, because the Shach seems to discount the fact that the Ramah actually uses b'makom shabasar sarich klipa, where the Shach seems to be talking about case when maybe a klipa is not necessary. It's a little confusing, and for that we're going to turn to Rabbi Akiva Eger, who's going to give a much better answer. So Rav Nachum, would you do us the honor of reading this? I think it's Sif Katan Chet.
You want me to read from your?
It's the same thing. It doesn't difference to me. There's no ellipses.
Just a second.
Well, there is at the end, but the beginning's the same.
Yeah, I actually wanted to do hay, but
You want to do hay? All right, so you can do hay and chet if you want.
First, I'll do het. Sorry. I'm just looking forward to my book. Het. This is a short one. B'tov lachmir b'makom she'ein hefsed merubeh.
Oh, I have a different chet. I have v'nireh. This is the shach seif katan chet. V'nireh de lo ka'amar.
That's what I wanted. V'nireh. That's vav by me. V'nireh de lo ka'amar. B'magen Avraham. B'chelech. Michalek. Dehacha davka b'tata gavra da klipa chumra ba'alma. So this goes back to what Rav Landis was asking, that here really it's the klipa is just a chumra ba'alma. The adamekar le bala b'zeh mekelim diavad. That here we're going to be lenient b'diavad, avalo ba'alma, but not by general klipot. Vayin sham v'davka b'nifsach hakiluach aval b'chalav rotech v'nafal al basar below nifsach hakiluach yesh lamar da'afilu shishim lo mahani the kol ha'irui nogea tamid b'basar v'kol tipa v'tipa ne'asra, because each drop and drop is going to get. In other words, that was one of the cases that the Ramah brought, that you could be lenient when the milk falls on top of the meat. And he says here we actually have to be machmir.
That's all I wanted to read, but you can keep going if you wanted. I just wanted to get that initial point about the kiluach, but more importantly that there's a distinction about how we view klipa, whether it is a chumra or a kula. And here it's like, oh, we do view klipa as a kula, but only in a case of tatagar, which seems to be a chumra by itself. But in other klipa, we actually have to treat it more seriously.
Right. What is the classic other klipa? What is another example where we would be more machmir?
The case of the shechting with the knife of the Avodah Zarah.
Maybe that, but where another siman that we learned?
Klisheni.
No, maybe klisheni also. I'm not sure, but the one I was thinking of is no, klisheni. I would say no, but actually, that's also a kula, but that's also just a chumrah. No,
also a chumrah. Yeah, okay.
By kvisha, by soaking, we say we can say sometimes that it's only a klipa, and that is actually a ikar din. No, but that's a different point. The Rebbe Kiva that I was interested in was hay, and at least by me it's asterisk. It's hay with an asterisk. I don't know if it's by you, but he says.
What's the initial words?
The initial words are, it's in brackets. Makom she'abasar tzarich klipa im lo kal fuhu. In a place where the meat needs to be peeled off, and you did do it. And then I skipped the first sentence. Well, I can read it all, but I don't. You've got other things to do. But he just says after the first sentence, which is quite long, he says, "Umekom makom efshar lomar the dafka beisur basar b'chalav the lecha isur doraita." This is what I was saying. The reason we can be lenient here is there's no isur doraita. The lohave derech bishul, because wait a second, even if it's tata gavar, it's not derech bishul, which is maybe different by avodah zarah. In other words, if you have, let's say, forbidden blood that falls on, or not avodah zarah, but forbidden blood that falls onto your food, that might be a different din than by basar b'chalav, where it's both tata gavar, but they're different kinds of tatar gavar, because here it's there you just have there you have no requirement of derech bishul.
So klipa is always a kula? Is that what you say?
No, I'm not saying that.
No, but I think this Rabbi Akiva's Eger is important because it gives the rationale for the later one, right? Klipa is a kula here only because of Tata Gavar. Why is Tata Gavar a kula here? Because it's not derech bishul.
Right.
Right. That exactly. That's what I was saying. That other.
Yeah, in a sense, being worried about to begin with was actually a chumrah. So here we got a cool. Here we got a cool. Yeah. If it, we should remember that a klipa is almost like a nothing. That's why it makes a difference.
So I'm gonna close the book on Seif Dala now because I see we're running out of time. We got a few more Simanim to go through. Let's see where we get through Hay, and at some point we're definitely not going to all the no say kalim that I wanted to get to. But that is life. So I'll take a read at the Gemara. So Talmud Bavli Masechah Chulin Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Bet. Again, this is one of those things where we dealt with previously about Kfisha and Maliach. Here it happens to be Maliach, but now we're going to see how it interacts with Basar B'chalav. So Amar Shmuel Maliach Harehu Kiroteach Kavush Hare Kamuvushal. So being salted is the equivalent is like boiling roteach, and pickled. Marinating is like cooking. And the Gemara, like 40 pages later, brings this up again. Hahu bar guzla de nafal lekada de kamcha. Shari Rav Chinana bered Rav me parshunya. So there was this goose, this bird that fell into a pot of kutach, into a pot of dairy, and which is presumably salty. And Rav Chinina bered Rav Parhishia permitted it. Amar Rava said, Man chakim lemishre ki hai gavna, ila Rav Chinana bered Rava mi parsharune. So it's like Rava says, what other wise sage could have possibly permitted this case other than Rav Chinana bered Rava mi parshania? Kasavar, because he holds Kasavar kia mar Shmuel b'aliach harehu karoteach. So he holds that when Shmuel said maliach hare karoteach, hane mile hecha de eno necha milcho. Those words only apply when the entity can't be eaten because of its saltiness. Of all high kutacha, but here in the case of kutach, hare necha milcho. It's eaten on account of its saltiness. So therefore, maliach hare kikaroteach wouldn't apply. V'hane milechai, and these words apply only when it is raw. About tzli by klipa, but when it's roasted, it requires a klipa. Vi be pile kule asor, and if it has little cracks in it, then the whole thing is forbidden. Vi mitabel betablin kule asor, and if it is salted, it has and if it's salted, it is also forbidden. So we have this great Gemara. We learn about the principle of maliach hare karoteach, and then we immediately see that there is a bit of a limitation on that in various cases. I don't really want to get into limitation right now because there's an important shach that gives out all the parameters of this. But bottom line, maliach hare karoteach. So before we turn the Shulchan Aruch, I do want to take a look at the Torah really quick. So turn to the Torah Seif Hey, picking up, I don't think we're, let me just look where I marked it. Sorry. All right, picking up right before Zayin. So that we're looking at the words Veha Demaliach Hashiv Kiroteach. Does everyone have that? It's about like halfway through Hay in the Torah. And about, yeah. Okay. Yavni, could you read that for us?
Sure. והד המליח חשיב כרותח דווקא בשאינו נאכל מחמת מלכו, פירש רש"י. דהיינו, do you want me to translate as I go?
Yeah.
And this statement that salting is thought of like salt is thought of like heat is specifically when it's so salty that you wouldn't eat it. ופירש רש"י דהיינו מליחת בשר להצניע שאינו נאכל עד שישרוהו במים וידיחוהו היטב. And Rashi explains that that's like, for example, when you're salting meat to preserve it, and you wouldn't eat it until you washed off the salt. ויש אומרים דלא מקרה אינו נאכל מחמת מלאכו, אלא כגון עיבוד שמולחין אותו הרבה לצורך הדרך. And there are those who say that it's not dafka things that you wouldn't eat, they're so salty. Rather, it's for example when you salt meat in order to you salt it a lot more than you would do it so at the table to preserve it for a trip. ורבנו תם פירש דכל מלח שמולחין לקדרה מקרה אינו נאכל מחמת מלכו אבל נאכל מחמת מלכו לא הווה כרותח. And Rabbeinu Tam says, like, if you're salting it for if you're like pre-salting it to put in a dish so that you're not going to take off the salt, but you wouldn't eat it like that, you would first cook it in a dish, then even that is considered eino ne'achal michamat melacho. But if you would eat it with its salt as it is without putting it in a separate dish, then it's not considered like rotach, even if it's salty.
Right. So thank you, Yavi. Right. So the Gemara gives a very enigmatic definition of what is maliach kerotech. Oh, it's when you wouldn't eat it on account of its saltiness. Of course, that doesn't tell us what that means. So I think the Torah here does a pretty good job in summarizing the various deot. Meaning, is it only for a journey, or Rabbeinu Tam basically seems like Rabbeinu Tam's threshold is very loose. It seems like pretty much anything could fall in that category, which is interesting because the Gemara uses a very salty dish that is kutach to prove exactly the opposite. But the Rabbeinu Tam does give it, and then others are more machmir. So we're just gonna jump right into the Shulchan Aruch to see how he paskins. So Josh, can you take us through Hey?
מליח שאינו יכול להאכל מחמת מלאכו, דהיינו כאין מליח שמולחים לקטרה, ושהה כדי מליחה לקטרה, כל זמן שלא הדיחו, מקרה אינו נאכל מחמת מלאכו. So I think, is that Rabbeinu Tam's position?
Yeah, he holds by Rabbeinu Tam, exactly right.
Is there anything which can't be eaten because of its saltiness, which is like the amount of salt that you put in a ketera?
Right, I think it's the normal salt. I think it's like the normal saltiness of a dish. Yeah. Again, it does. I was actually a little bit unclear about this. Like, what then differentiates it between?
Let me jump in there. I believe that the meliach lekadera means the salting that we do halachically in order to then be able to boil the food.
So you're talking about dam.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. In other words, if you want to roast food on the grill, you don't need to salt it at all. We only salt food in order to use it in a kedera. So maliach lekadera, I believe, means salting to the extent that it would now be permissible to boil it, as opposed to salting for the purpose of preserving it.
Right. So I'm glad you bring that up, and I think you're right, except that the shach minimally, and I think others starts to draw a distinction between the salting that happens for blood and then the salting that happens for other foods.
Okay.
But we don't have
wrong.
time necessarily
I
to
could be
get
wrong.
that. Right. I was thinking of it sort of like pre-salting a pot, like in advance of the cooking, the amount of salting you would do for that, but I'm not sure. All right, Josh, can you if you just take us through the rest of the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch.
ויש אומרים, דלאחר ששהה במלאכו, I can't read that word, שיעור מליחה לא מקרה, אחר כך רותח. There are those who say that that amount is not considered רותח. ולצורך גדול, כגון בהפסד מרובה, והוא לצורך סעודת מצווה, יש לסמוך על מקילים. So for a great need, and then he spells it out, great loss involving Seudat Mitzvah, you can rely on that, on opinions other than Rabbeinu Tam.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily other than Rabbeinu Tam, it's more of a question of at what point has it become that salt? If we're taking Rabbeinu Tam's definition, at what point do we reach that definition? Is it the time of the salting? Mm-hmm. Or, is it the time like in which the salting occurs? Or is it the time after that, right? So Shulchan Aruch says kedei milicha, meaning he's talking about that specific amount of time. And this Yesh Omrim is the after. So the Yesh Omrim is, I think, more machmir. And he's saying in a hefsed meruba, you can rely on the within the time span. It's a much smaller span.
אבל בלאו הכי אין להקל כלל. So apart from this situation of hefsed meruba, don't be מקל. אפילו לא נמלח בשר משני צדדיו, רק מצד אחד, כל שנמלח מליחה שאינו נאכל מחמת מלכו, מחשב רותח. And even if it wasn't salted on both sides, only salted on one side, that's also considered salty enough to be considered rotach. אבל כל שלא נמלח כל כך, נחשב צונן. Anything less than this is considered צונן, cold. אפילו נמלח משני צדדים, even if it's on both sides. ויש אומרים, דענן אין בקיאים בדבר, ויש לנו לחשוב אפילו מליחת צלי כרותח. Okay, and there are those who say that we don't know how much all these measures are, and even the amount of salt that you would need to kosher for tzili, for roasting, even that amount of salt is rotach. V'tov le'achmir b'makom she'en hefsed meruba. If there's no other factors, you should be machmir.
Right, so I'm going to stop you there, right? So this whole not knowing about saltiness is very much in line with like the general Ashkenazi opinion is like, we can't differentiate between fatty and lean. We can't differentiate between various shurim. It tries to take some of the guesswork out of it. And Yavni, you're totally right. I misspoke about the difference between the two. So we're gonna stop there. In terms of Vav, Zayin, and Chet is very straightforward. Vav and Zayin just get a little bit more into the particulars of this Maliach concept and how they interact with other seifim. The most important source I would say to look at of those two is that Shach Kaf He, because the end of our Gemara brings a bunch of okimtot on the principle of Maliach Keroteach, but it is very unclear as to how those ukimtot actually pan out, whether it's cold, whether it's hot, whether it was once cold, whether it was once hot. When do the cracks come into play? When do the tavlin come into play. And the Shach really nicely lays out 3 shitot on that topic and how the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah interface with that. So thank you guys for your participation. I really enjoyed, and I hope you did as well.
Thank you very much, Noam. It was a lot of material. You did a good job.
This was great. So just a minor, well, not so minor. We saw in the Shach that he makes a distinction in Tzorach Gadol. That Hatzah Meruba is really the Tzorach Gadol, and everything else is Tzorach Gadol Ksat. And therefore, if you can be, Machmir, you can be Machmir in every other reason, like Sudas Mitzvah. So, okay, so find something else. Go out to the store and get some yogurt or something. But for Hatzah Meruba, that still plays in. That's very important in terms of Psak Halacha. Yes, Shkayach, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Can I throw in a couple points too?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
First of all, actually at the end of that Siman that you stopped in, sorry, at the end of that Sif Hey, not the end, but towards the end of the Mechaber, he talks about Klipa of Maliach, and that's actually what I meant when I asked that question before, and I said Kavusha, I actually meant that. That klipa of Maluach that's the more machmir klipa, where he says if you have salty things he says sarich liklof shneihem b'makom negiatan im echad mehem maluach v'asheni tafel muter b'hadacha, right? But if they're both salty, you need to do klipa, and that klipa is a more machmir klipa. That was what I meant. And just one other point, which is that we didn't learn the laws of salting, which is a whole separate section in the Shulchan Aruch. But I just want to make a point, which is that there's 3 things that you do when you salt. First, there's hadacha kamaita or kamaisa. There's first rinsing, then salting, and then rinsing again. So that's the process. You rinse, you salt, and then you rinse off the salt. So that's what he was talking about in Sif Hey. He's talking about Malicha Lekader B'Shahab, and there's also a certain amount of time that it has to sit in the salt. You can't just put the salt on and then immediately rinse it off. There's a minimum amount of time that you have to leave it in. I think it's about 18 minutes, but maybe I don't remember exactly. But so he's saying it has to be in the salt that amount of time in order for it to be considered really hot and be called and cause this problem. It has to be shahak kedei malicha lekedera. It has to be in that salt for that halachic time frame in order to qualify as being hot and then transferring flavor. And then he says, but then if you roast, then if you rinse it off, then it's already cold again. So that's no problem. And on that comes the Ramah and says, actually, there's a crazy opinion, which says after that amount of time that it was supposed to sit, let's say it's 18 minutes in the salt, now it's already cold down again. That amount of time, it's a kula. He's saying once it's been finished salted, even though you didn't rinse it off, the salt has stopped doing its action, it's finished, and therefore it's as though it's cold. Maybe that was all clear. Maybe I'm just repeating, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of a summary then. That's all.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So next week is Shavuos, so we don't have a class. But the week after that, I will be doing Tzadi Bet, Bezrat Hashem. It's a huge topic. Actually, it probably should be 4 classes, but we'll do it in 2 classes. Okay. So Laila Tov, thank you very much, Noam. I also gave you a huge amount of stuff to cover, and to do it in one shear is kind of impossible. So you did a great job from the time you had.
Thank you. Chag Sameach, everyone.
Stay safe, everybody, and Chag Sameach.
Thanks.